A bright afternoon sun poured over Buckingham Palace, its golden rays glinting off the iron gates as a crowd of tourists shuffled eagerly to find the perfect photo spot. Flags fluttered lazily in the breeze, street performers entertained children, and cameras clicked like a swarm of mechanical bees. But amidst the buzz, a silence stood still, and his name was Blackwood, unflinching, unblinking, unbreakable. 29-year-old Thomas Blackwood was more than just a royal guard. He was a symbol. 8 years of service, 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, and a personal invitation to stand at the Queen's side during state visits had forged him into the embodiment of duty. To the world, he looked like a statue in red. To those who knew, he was steel beneath the stillness. And today, that steel was about to be tested. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. A sleek black car rolled up the drive, its windows tinted, its presence demanding attention. A man emerged, tall, silver-haired, draped in a long black coat that billowed like a judge's robe. He moved with the confidence of a man who never heard the word no. It was Lawrence Whitaker, 64, the most feared judge in the British legal system. Famous for his biting tongue and zero-tolerance courtroom, he had become a media icon. Tabloids called him the verdict machine. His presence at the palace was supposedly for a documentary, The Crown and the Gavel, Justice Meets Royalty. But for Whitaker, it was more than just a documentary shoot. It was an opportunity to showcase his supremacy, in law, in presence, and, as fate would have it, over anyone in uniform. He strolled toward the gates with his producer, cameraman trailing behind. And then he saw Blackwood, standing still, unyielding, even as tourists gathered and giggled nearby. The judge stopped, adjusted his silk tie, and smirked. "Let's have some fun," he muttered. He approached Blackwood slowly, theatrically, knowing the cameras were rolling. Pausing inches from the guard's face, he leaned in and snapped his fingers. Once. Loud. Sharp. Blackwood didn't flinch. The crowd gasped. The judge's eyes narrowed. He stepped even closer and did it again. Snap. "I said," he mocked. "You can relax, son. You're dismissed." Still, Blackwood stood, a statue carved from silence. Children stopped laughing. Tourists froze. Even the street performers quieted down. And Whitaker, perhaps sensing he had crossed an invisible line, chuckled and turned to the camera. "Look at this," he said, gesturing. "A grown man pretending to be a mannequin. Doesn't even blink when spoken to. What discipline? Or is it just good acting?" He turned his back to Blackwood. "This is the problem with tradition. It's all theater. No substance." But in that moment, something happened. Blackwood stepped forward. Only once. But one step was enough to change everything. The ground seemed to shift beneath the crowd. The cameras recentered. Whitaker turned slowly, his smile faltering. Blackwood's voice was calm, not loud, but resolute. "Sir, please step back. This is a ceremonial post. Do not interfere with the guard." The judge laughed nervously. "You must be joking." "No, sir," Blackwood said. "You are standing too close to a designated royal perimeter. Continued interference may result in official action." "You're threatening me?" Whitaker barked. "I am informing you," Blackwood replied. The crowd was silent. The cameraman panned slowly. Tourists held their breath. Even pigeons stopped fluttering for a moment. Whitaker's face twisted into disbelief. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to signal dominance. A subtle motion, a challenge. But Blackwood didn't blink. He simply returned to his position, still and silent once again. That's when palace security arrived. 2 officers dressed in sharp black uniforms approached quickly. They whispered something into Whitaker's ear. His face dropped. The footage, they explained, would not be permitted for broadcast. He had violated official protocol by physically interfering with a guard on duty. The judge tried to argue, to threaten with legal jargon, but the officers remained calm, respectful, but firm. Whitaker was escorted from the scene, humiliated, his reputation punctured not by scandal, but by silence. But this was only the beginning. What no one in the crowd knew, what even Blackwood didn't know, was that this moment, captured on dozens of phones, would go viral. Within hours, the internet erupted. Some defended the judge's boldness. Others hailed Blackwood as a hero of dignity. And as the story grew, so did the consequences. Because Whitaker had crossed a line, and soon he would find himself summoned to face consequences, not in the court of public opinion, but in the very courtroom he ruled like a king. This time, the tables would turn, and the man who thought he ruled with the gavel would be judged not by law, but by principle. The footage spread like wildfire. By nightfall, the video of Judge Whitaker snapping his fingers at the silent royal guard had reached over 4 million views on YouTube, doubled that on TikTok, and was featured on the evening news in both the UK and the US. Hashtags like Thatcher Silent Justice, Guard vs. Gavel, and Whitaker Snaps trended for 48 hours straight. Some people laughed, others were outraged, but most were just shocked. A man known for his courtroom command had just been calmly silenced, not by rebuttal or ruling, but by a motionless soldier in red. But Whitaker wasn't the kind of man who bowed to public opinion. He believed in facts, rules, hierarchy. And in his mind, the world had gotten it all wrong. Inside his London townhouse that night, Whitaker sat at his desk, watching the video for the 5th time. He paused at the moment Blackwood spoke, clear, commanding, and utterly composed. "Sir, please step back. This is a ceremonial post." He slammed the laptop shut. "This is nonsense," he muttered. He broke protocol by speaking. "Guards don't talk. That's the whole point." His advisor, Julian, stood quietly in the corner. "Perhaps, sir, we should issue a statement." "A statement?" Whitaker scoffed. "To apologize to a man who stood still for a living? No, this will blow over, like it always does." But it didn't. By the next morning, the palace had issued a rare public statement. "We commend Guard Blackwood for his professionalism and restraint under public pressure. The integrity of the Royal Guard is to be respected at all times." Even Parliament members started chiming in. A few called for Whitaker's resignation. One particularly vocal MP tweeted, "If Judge Whitaker can't show respect to those who serve, he shouldn't be trusted to pass judgment on others." Then came the petition. 100,000 signatures in just 3 days. The demand? A formal investigation by the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. And they agreed. A preliminary ethics review was scheduled. Judge Whitaker would be required to appear. For the first time in over 3 decades, Lawrence Whitaker wasn't sitting behind the bench, he was standing before it. Meanwhile, Thomas Blackwood was having a very different kind of week. He had been offered talk show appearances, book deals, and brand endorsements. A major luxury watch company even wanted him to be the face of their Time, Tradition, Honor campaign. He refused them all. Instead, he returned to duty. Every day, he reported to Buckingham Palace. Same uniform, same posture, same discipline. But this time, the crowds gathered not just to see the changing of the guard, they came to see him. Children asked for autographs, veterans saluted, tourists whispered his name like a folk hero. But Blackwood remained unchanged. Except for one thing, he couldn't stop thinking about that moment, not when Whitaker snapped his fingers, but the moment he spoke. The breach of protocol. He hadn't been trained to speak. Guards weren't supposed to speak. Ever. That night, after duty, he sat in the barracks and typed a letter to his commanding officer. Subject: voluntary withdrawal from service. He stared at the screen for a long time. But before he could click send, a soft knock came at the door. It was Major Ellison, his superior officer and a man of few words. "I heard about the letter," Ellison said, closing the door behind him. Blackwood stood. "You're not dismissed," Ellison said before Blackwood could speak. "Sit down." He sat. "You think you dishonored the guard?" Ellison asked. "I broke the silence," Blackwood replied. "The uniform is built on tradition. I shattered it." Ellison walked over, pulled out a phone, and played something. It was a message, a voicemail. "Major Ellison, this is Sergeant Wells from the Falklands Regiment. I just wanted to say..." Blackwood reminded the world that standing still doesn't mean staying silent. "My daughter watched his video and asked me why no one ever taught her that kind of strength. She saluted the TV." Ellison paused the recording. "Do you still think you broke something?" he asked. Blackwood didn't answer. His throat tightened. "You didn't break tradition, son," Ellison said. "You reminded the world why it exists." Blackwood nodded, eyes glistening. The letter stayed unsent. But across town, Whitaker wasn't experiencing any redemption. The courtroom assigned for the ethics hearing was far smaller than his usual bench, but it felt cavernous. The judge's chair didn't belong to him anymore. Instead, he stood at a narrow table beside his counsel, hands folded tightly, jaw locked. The lead investigator cleared her throat. "Judge Whitaker, we are here to assess your conduct on the 4th of this month outside Buckingham Palace. The footage shows you approaching a ceremonial guard, interfering with their post, and attempting to publicly humiliate him." Whitaker remained silent. "We also have multiple complaints from court staff, law clerks, and former colleagues regarding your behavior, but today's hearing is specifically about the palace incident." His lawyer stood. "If I may, my client wishes to make a brief statement." The investigator nodded. Whitaker rose. "I understand that the public saw arrogance, and perhaps there was some," he began, voice low. "But I never meant to shame the guard. It was a moment of poor judgment, not malice." He looked up. "But I believe this entire matter has been blown out of proportion by social media hysteria and political opportunism." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying the issue is not your behavior, but its exposure?" Whitaker hesitated. "I'm saying it wasn't serious." A pause. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Everyone turned. It was Blackwood, in full uniform. He took a seat quietly at the back row, eyes forward, posture rigid, but this time no longer invisible. Whitaker saw him. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Whitaker flinched. Not from fear, but from something far more unfamiliar. Accountability. The investigator leaned forward. "We will be calling witnesses to speak to your history of conduct, Judge Whitaker. Some will be from within the judiciary. Others will be from beyond." Whitaker looked back at Blackwood again, but the guard no longer met his gaze. He sat in silence, as always. But this silence was different. This silence had weight. It had presence. And for the first time in decades, Whitaker realized something he had never considered. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore. The courtroom was colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning, but because every word spoken felt like a scalpel cutting deeper into the legacy of a man who once ruled this very chamber. Judge Lawrence Whitaker, once the lion of British justice, now sat on the other side of the bench, eyes sunken, lips drawn tight, fingers twitching every few seconds. The ethics committee had been questioning him for over an hour. They reviewed transcripts, played clips, read testimonies. Some were from interns who described the judge's arrogance, others from clerks who had endured years of subtle humiliation and outright mockery. Even a retired judge admitted, "Whitaker forgot long ago that justice is supposed to be blind, not prideful." But nothing seemed to shake him. Not until they called the final witness of the day. "Call Mr. Thomas Blackwood to the stand." A quiet rustle swept the courtroom. Blackwood rose from his seat in the gallery. Fully uniformed, red tunic pressed to perfection, medals glinting beneath the court lights. He marched toward the witness box, not with a performer's flair, but with a soldier's purpose. He took the oath. The lead investigator leaned forward. "Mr. Blackwood, please recount the events of the 4th of this month as they occurred from your position on duty." Blackwood nodded. "I was stationed outside Buckingham Palace fulfilling my ceremonial duties. At approximately 3:17 p.m., Judge Whitaker approached the perimeter with a camera crew. His voice was steady, trained, controlled. He crossed the restricted boundary, stood directly in front of me, and began snapping his fingers near my face. He paused, twice. The courtroom was silent. I gave a verbal warning. It was not premeditated. It was instinct, the same kind of instinct that keeps you alive in a war zone. A threat entered my space. I responded with calm authority. Whitaker's head hung slightly now. The investigator continued, "Did the judge say anything else during this encounter?" Blackwood nodded. He mocked the uniform, suggested we were actors, called the tradition a farce. This then turned to his film crew and dismissed the entire role as empty ceremony. "Did you feel threatened?" "No, I felt disrespected." "And why does that matter to you, Mr. Blackwood?" He looked out at the committee, and then, unexpectedly, directly at Whitaker. "Because I've stood in front of a monarch and in front of enemy fire. In both cases, I stood still. Not because I couldn't move, but because I chose not to. That uniform teaches you discipline. It demands restraint. But that day, for the first time in 8 years, I almost broke." A long pause. He continued, his voice softening just enough to pull the room in. "Not because of what he said, but because I realized people were watching. Children, veterans, tourists. And I saw it in their eyes. If I didn't speak, he would become the symbol. Not me, not the uniform, him. And I couldn't let that happen." Someone in the audience quietly exhaled, a sound so small, yet so heavy. Whitaker slowly raised his head. "Do you regret speaking?" asked the investigator. "No," said Blackwood, "because silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of self-control. That day, I didn't speak to attack. I spoke to remind, of values, of history, of honor." The room sat in reverent quiet. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," the investigator said. "You may step down." But before he could move, Whitaker suddenly stood. "Permission to address the witness," he asked, voice raw. The room hesitated. The investigator nodded once. Whitaker turned to face Blackwood, eyes glassy. "You said you almost broke that day," he said slowly. "Did you know I did?" Blackwood blinked. Whitaker continued, "The moment you spoke, I realized something. You weren't just a man in uniform. You were everything I had forgotten to be." He took a shaky breath. "For 30 years I judged people, condemned them, corrected them, but I never asked if I deserved to stand above them. That day, when you told me to step back, it wasn't just a warning, it was a verdict." No one moved. "And I thank you for it." The words were not loud, but in that moment, they were thunder. A judge, not only admitting fault, but recognizing the man he had tried to belittle as someone greater than himself. Even the committee members sat stunned. Blackwood nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He returned to his seat. The proceedings paused briefly. Everyone needed a moment to breathe. Outside the courthouse, hundreds had gathered. Protesters, supporters, press. Some waved signs reading "Respect the uniform." Others held placards quoting Blackwood's speech. Silence is not weakness. It is strength under pressure. As the committee retreated to deliberate, Whitaker remained in his chair, unmoving. He was no longer trying to defend his name. He was trying to understand the weight of it. And in the corner of the room, Unnoticed by most, Blackwood quietly folded his gloves into his cap and waited. Not for vindication, not for praise, but for closure. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about reminding a nation and its highest judge that even in stillness, dignity speaks. 3 hours passed. The committee had retreated to deliberate behind closed doors, but the weight of their silence was palpable. The courtroom, though quiet, felt like it was holding its breath. Whitaker remained seated, shoulders no longer squared like a judge, but slumped like a man waiting for a sentence. Blackwood hadn't moved either. His back straight, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed forward, as though still on post outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. Finally, the door opened. The lead ethics investigator entered, followed by 2 other members of the disciplinary board. They took their seats without fanfare. The room tensed. After careful consideration, the investigator began, and in light of witness testimony, video evidence, and the judge's own statements, this committee has reached a unanimous decision. Whitaker's jaw locked tight. Blackwood simply inhaled once. "Judge Lawrence Whitaker," she said firmly, "you are hereby suspended from judicial duty for a period of 6 months." A wave of reaction swept through the gallery. Not gasps, not cheers, just a quiet release of tension. The silence said enough. The investigator continued. "Additionally, you will be required to complete 200 hours of public service, specifically assigned to ceremonial and veteran outreach programs, including but not limited to service with the Honorable Corps of Gentlemen at Arms." A flicker of emotion passed across Whitaker's face. Disbelief, then resignation. "You will report directly to the Lord Chamberlain's office within 14 days, she concluded. "This hearing is adjourned." The gavel struck, but it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like the end of an era. As the courtroom began to clear, journalists rushed to call in their stories. Some spectators stood just to catch a glimpse of Blackwood, but he didn't move, not until Whitaker did. The former judge walked slowly toward him, not like a man approaching an adversary, but like a man approaching a monument. "I wanted to tell you something," he said softly. "When I'm standing there next month in full regalia, doing what you've done every day for years, I hope I freeze." Blackwood tilted his head. "I hope I feel the cold, the ache in my feet, the urge to blink, because then maybe I'll finally understand what it means to stand still for something." There was no audience, no cameras now, just one man humbling himself before another. Blackwood extended his hand. Whitaker hesitated, then took it. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of 2 lifetimes. Outside, the press was waiting. Flashes popped. Microphones reached. Voices called. But Blackwood didn't speak to them. He walked past the crowd, past the headlines, past the noise. He returned to his barracks, hung up his uniform, and quietly submitted a single line to his commanding officer. "I request transfer to ceremonial training duties for new recruits." Because he knew now, this wasn't about standing still. It was about helping others learn why we do. Weeks passed. Whitaker began his service, awkward at first in ceremonial dress, stumbling through posture and formation drills. But as time went on, something shifted. He began listening more, speaking less. And when tourists passed and asked, "What does that uniform mean?" he answered with reverence. And somewhere in London, a young recruit stood a little straighter when Blackwood passed by, not out of fear, but out of inspiration. Because a guard who once broke protocol to protect dignity had become a mentor, a symbol, a reminder that strength isn't in the shout. It's in the silence that chooses not to break. Respect isn't about power. It's about posture. Not how loudly you speak, but how still you can stand when the world pushes against you. So the next time someone disrespects what you believe in, will you snap back? Or will you stand still like Blackwood, with honor? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in his place. And if this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because more powerful true-to-life stories are on the way. Thank you for watching.